Hi students, Jordan here and welcome back to Bio 25 Online. In today's class we'll be going over Lab 12, which involves muscle tissue and muscle histology, and we'll be talking a lot about the anatomy that goes along with the physiology you should hopefully be learning about in lecture. And without further ado, let's just get into the video. So today we're going to be talking about muscle tissue and muscle histology. Today we'll be working out of pages 61 through 63 in your lab manual, so I would encourage you all to get your lab manuals out and follow along throughout the presentation. The first thing we're going to talk about is muscle histology, and what we mean when we say muscle histology is basically how we distinguish the three different types of muscular tissue. So what is muscle tissue? Let's define that first. Muscle tissue is specialized for contraction. It also is responsible for production of all body movement. And then we have three different types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue, which is the large body muscles responsible for movement. And then we have cardiac muscle tissue, which is found only in the heart. And finally, we have smooth muscle tissue, which is found in the walls of hollow contracting organs. And these are organs such as your blood vessels or your urinary bladder or your respiratory, digestive, and reproductive tracts. So let's talk a little bit more about muscle tissue and how we classify muscle cells. We classify muscle cells based on their appearance. So first we break them down into striated versus non-striated. And striated just means muscle cells with a banded appearance, whereas non-striated would be not banded or smooth appearance. And then finally, muscle cells can have a single nuclei or they can have multiple nuclei. So we often define them by the presence or non-presence of nuclei. And then also muscle cells can be controlled voluntarily or involuntarily, and that's another way we classify them. Alright, first let's talk about skeletal muscle. If you'll notice, you have a section in your lab manual where it asks you to draw skeletal muscle, so why don't you do that while we talk about it? First of all, skeletal muscles are long and thin. They're also usually called muscle fibers. Skeletal muscles do not divide, and new fibers are produced by stem cells, which are also called myosatellite cells. As you can see by the picture here, skeletal muscles have a banded appearance and they're also striated. You can see the presence of nuclei here as well. Next, let's talk about cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. So cardiac muscle cells are actually called cardiocytes. Sometimes you'll also hear them called cardiomyocytes. It just depends on their function. They also form branching networks called intercalated discs, and this is what allows them to have a pacemaking function. And finally, as I kind of alluded to just now, they're regulated by pacemaker cells, so this is what allows the cardiac muscle tissue to contract with itself and cause the heartbeat. And then we have smooth muscle cells, which are small and tapered, and they're able to divide and regenerate. On this slide, you can see pictures of those two cell types that we just described, and you can kind of appreciate, hopefully, the striated appearance of the cardiac muscle cells and the fact that they're intercalated. So they do look a little stacked and branched and connected, whereas smooth muscle cells, I hope you can appreciate that they're a little more stacked on top of each other, and they're not striated and they are nucleated. So hopefully you can appreciate that morphology. So now we're going to talk about muscle components and muscle structures. So if you'll look at the top of page 62, this is the portion of the lab that we're on, and I would encourage you to follow along in your lab manual while I talk about these different structures. The first structure on our list is whole muscle. So I want you to think about your own body and see if you can identify a whole muscle. Examples of whole muscles could be your deltoid, your biceps, your triceps, really any muscle in your body that's a skeletal muscle represents a whole muscle. Next, we have what's called a muscle fascicle. So hopefully you can look at this picture and find the muscle fascicle and appreciate that structure. Next, we have the muscle fiber. These are also called muscle cells, myocytes, or myofibers. So hopefully you can again look at the picture and appreciate the muscle fiber or muscle cell. Next, we have what's called a myofibril, and again, you can see that in this picture here, so hopefully you can appreciate what a myofibril is. And finally, we have a sarcomere, which you can't see here, but we're going to talk about sarcomeres a little bit more in depth in a second. So to kind of reiterate, Fascicles are what make up the whole muscle, and muscle fibers are what actually make up the fascicles, and then myofibrils are what make up the muscle fibers. So it's kind of like different layers of these structures that make up the bigger structures, if that makes sense. Next, we're going to talk about some of the associated structures of the muscle. So we have what's called the epimysium, which is this like layer of collagen connective tissue that surrounds the whole muscle. Next, we have the paramecium, which is made up of collagen and elastic connective tissue, and the paramecium is actually what's surrounding the different fascicles. Finally, we have the endomysium, which is made up of collagen and elastic connective tissue, and it actually surrounds individual muscle fibers, and it also contains capillaries, nerve axons, and satellite cells. So hopefully you can appreciate these three different layers of the whole muscle, and I would also expect you to know these definitions, and these definitions are on your quiz this week, so I would encourage you to study them. Next, we have tendons, and tendons are simply what connect muscles to other muscles. Next, we have blood vessels, which are pretty easy to find on this photo. And as you guys know, blood vessels are really just another source of nutrients for our tissues. Finally, we have satellite cells, which are closely bound to the outer surface of the sarcolemma. And hopefully you can see them in this picture here. They're those little blue dots. So now we're going to talk about the components of a muscle cell a little bit more in depth. If we were in class together, we would be using this model to identify and talk about the different components of a muscle cell. So hopefully you can follow along while I talk you through these different structures and kind of appreciate what they look like in a muscle cell model. So first we have the endomysium, and as you can see in this picture, the endomysium is just surrounding that muscle cell. Next we have the sarcolemma, which is that pink layer at the bottom of the picture. Hopefully you can see it. And that's actually the plasma membrane of the cell. Next we have T-tubules, which are these blue structures here, and they're just invaginations of the sarcolemma. Next we have the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is that kind of tan-looking structure that looks kind of like a spider web. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum is just the endoplasmic reticulum of the muscle cell. It's also the site of calcium storage, and I think that's really important for you to know that the sarcoplasmic reticulum is the site of calcium storage. Next we have myofibrils, and hopefully you can remember from earlier what a myofibril is, and you can kind of find one in this picture and appreciate what that looks like. Next we have mitochondria, and as you guys know, mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells, and they kind of help provide that source of ATP and energy, and which is also really important in muscle cells, right? Because this is a cell type that needs a lot of energy because it's constantly contracting. And then finally, just to reiterate, we have satellite cells, and satellite cells are the stem cells that divide to produce new muscle fibers. So basically, it's a mechanism of repair. So now we're going to talk about sarcomeres, filaments, and proteins. So the sarcomere is the functional unit of the muscle. So this is the thing that's actually doing the contracting. And Dr. Woolsey is going to cover that mechanism a little bit, but I'm going to go over the anatomy with you guys. So if you'll flip to page 63, we're going to start talking about the anatomy of the sarcomere. So first we have the Z line, and the Z line is this teal colored line on the outside of the sarcomere. Then we have the M line, which is this pink colored line in the middle. Next we have thin filaments and thick filaments, and thin filaments are just these green filaments that are running horizontally, whereas the thick filaments are the red filaments that are a little bit thicker and they're also running horizontally. Now we have some proteins that we need to talk about. So in this picture, hopefully you can see and appreciate the different proteins of the sarcomere. The first one we have is actin, and hopefully you can see and identify actin in this picture. Next we have troponin, and troponin is also in this picture. They're kind of those little, they kind of look like corn. They're those little balls on the bottom of that picture. Next we have tropomyosin, which are these little rope-like structures that you can hopefully see and appreciate. And finally we have myosin and titin. And each of these proteins has a really key and important role in what's called the sliding filament model, and that's the model of muscle contraction. And hopefully Dr. Woolsey goes over the sliding filament model with you guys in lecture, but this is just the anatomy that leads to that physiology. And if you guys get confused about that at all, I would encourage you to come to my office hours this week and we can break down the sliding filament model a little bit more in depth. So that's all I have for you guys. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out via email or text or whatever modality works for you. I'm here for you, and whatever you need, we'll get through it together. So finally, for our fun anatomy fact of the day, the heart is the hardest working muscle in the body. It actually pumps 5 quarts of blood per minute, and that's the equivalent of 2,000 gallons daily. So hopefully you can appreciate that your heart is constantly working hard for you, so maybe you can kind of adopt this attitude of working hard in your life for your heart. Okay, so hopefully that helped muscle tissue and muscle histology make a little bit more sense. If you noticed in the video, I did give you some hints throughout on what will be on your quiz this week. And just as a reminder, that quiz opens up on Wednesday and is due on Friday. So make sure you stay on top of your deadlines. And without further ado, I just want to encourage you all to stay safe, stay kind, and stay healthy. I will see you in the next one.